So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is our second Tech Talk with the New York Public Library. We're part of the technology training programs. I'm going to pass it off to our Associate Director, Brandy McNeil, who is going to introduce us, and then we'll go from there. So to Brandy McNeil, Associate Director of Technology Training Programs.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. As Jenna mentioned, I am Brandy McNeil. I'm the Associate Director for the New York Public Library's Adult Tech Education program called Tech Connect. Here at NYPL Tech Connect, we provide free digital literacy and workforce readiness classes in more than 80 libraries across the Bronx, Manhattan, and Staten Island. And we are currently doing all of these classes right now virtually because of COVID pandemic. So feel free to join any of our classes at nypl.org/computers, and you can register there. We have classes for adults at all skill levels. We have topics such as internet basics, advanced Excel, Python, JavaScript. We do graphic design classes, audio and video production, podcasting, and just a bunch more. You'll see it all on the website. You can also see more of our Tech Talks. We are going to be having them several times a year. And so we are happy that you guys are joining us for this one. And our Tech Talks are meant to take you behind the scenes of the tech industry and just to kind of get an idea of what happens, what goes on from the experts. And so we do those in a variety of ways through panel discussions, demos, and fireside chats. So today we have a team of experts who will discuss race, bias, and inequality and how it relates to artificial intelligence. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tech Connect hosts for today, Pei-Jin Chen and Jenna Lee. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandy, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us. I'm Jenna Lee.
Pei-Jin Chen.
And here we gathered a bunch of experts today, and we want to talk about artificial intelligence and how it relates to racism, bias, and inequality. We want to look at these particular systems and how they're playing out, how they're operating in society, and tackle some big questions about what they look like. I want to introduce our panelists today that we have joining us, so thank you for joining us. We have Julia Stoyanovich from New York University. She is a professor in engineering and computer science there, and she's also the director of the Center for Responsible AI, and she's done work as in an advisory capacity in New York City. We also have Safiya Noble, who is an author of a wonderful book called Algorithms of Oppression, which is a look at how negative biases against particularly women of color and other minority groups are embedded in the search engines that we initially thought were neutral. And she takes a look at those algorithms. And she's also a professor of information studies and African American studies at UCLA. And is the founder of the Center for Critical Inquiry, Critical Internet Inquiry there. We also have other panelists joining us today.
Yeah, we have Eric Corbett, who is a scholar and researcher at the Smart Cities and Human Computer Interaction at the Center for Urban Science and Progress at NYU. And we also have Brian Christian, a technology writer, the author of several books such as The Most Human Human, Algorithms to Live By, and most recently, The Alignment Problem.
Just as an overview of what we're going to do today, we're going to start out. I know that AI and artificial intelligence is a term that gets thrown around quite a bit. So we're going to sort of try to get all of us on the same page here and start out with some definitions. We have some very technical folks in the room. We have some authors in the room who have described this stuff for a living. So we're going to sort of lay the foundation of what artificial intelligence is, so we're all on the same page, look at some examples and start out with it. We see a little bit under the hood of how it works, just a taste. There's obviously so much more we can go into here. Then we're going to hear about a couple different case studies of artificial intelligence at work, and check out how it's doing in terms of fairness and bias, particularly with respect to race. So we're talking about hiring practices, and Julia is going to take us through that example. We're going to talk about predictive policing, and Brian Christian is going to take us through that example. We're going to pivot and talk a little bit about search algorithms, and Safiya Noble will take us through that case study, and we're going to talk about the civic relationships between minority groups and local city governments. And Eric will share some of his research in that area. After we sort of hit these topics in case study and sort of short little segments, we're going to open up the floor and talk a little bit about future directions, and take an assessment of the field, say, how are we doing now, and try to understand where to go from there. To get started, I think we want to lay the foundation and sort of get an idea of what's going on in the field of artificial intelligence. So, Peijin?
Yeah, so I think we'll throw this first one to Brian. Brian, your book is about this subject, I think, in many ways, but can you describe generally how pervasive AI, or whatever we want to call it, is in our society today?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now we are really living through two separate trends that are kind of colliding. And one is the incredible acceleration in the actual capacity of what AI systems can do. In the last 10 years, there's been a huge breakthrough that's been known as sort of the deep learning revolution. And now we have systems that can recognize objects and do things like language and vision that weren't previously possible. So we have on this one hand, this incredible leap forward in the raw capability. On the other hand, we have, I think, a equally, if not more significant trend, which is the sort of the proliferation of these artificial intelligence systems, or what I might call machine learning systems, which are systems that rather than being explicitly programmed are essentially taught by example. You can say, here's a bunch of examples of people who we'd want to hire, and these are people we don't want to hire. Now tell us which resumes coming in, we should pay attention to. Or these are the people we want to give loans, these people we don't want to give loans. Make future loan decisions accordingly. And so these systems can really learn implicitly just by example. And I think that is both their power and their danger in equal measure. So the question is really, are they learning what we think that they're learning? Are they doing what we intend for them to be doing? And this is a problem that goes by various names, but it's often referred to as the alignment problem. Are the objectives of these systems, as they are actually built and trained and deployed, reflecting the intentions of the human designers that they created, them? And so this has, I think, quickly become one of, if not the central question of the field of AI.
How much does the average person interact with some kind of AI on a daily basis? You mentioned loans, things that are very much, part of our lives, like loans we need to run our businesses or to buy houses. What else is there that we interact with that we may not know about?
Yeah, that's a great way of framing it. So I think in a way, it's hard to get through a normal week without encountering some kind of machine learning model or AI system in almost every facet of your life. It's, whether you get approved or rejected for a credit card, it's you submit your resume to a job. Maybe more people applied for that job than the employer can actually look at. So there's some AI system on the back end that's filtering which resumes might actually get passed forward. Increasingly, we're seeing systems used for medical diagnostics. So your test results might end up getting, your X-ray or your CAT scan might end up getting shown to an AI system in addition to or instead of a human expert. There is an incredibly accelerating use of AI within the criminal justice system, which we'll touch on a little bit later in terms of what happens when people have an arraignment and their trial date is set. Are they released? How is their bail set, et cetera? Later on, how are they reviewed for parole? These decisions are increasingly being made with input from these statistical so-called risk assessment models. And of course, it's everywhere in our digital experience, right? So what ads target us? Do we see ads for job opportunities that, are relevant to us or might actually accelerate, our career trajectory? What do we see when we search for things? I know Safiya is going to be talking about that later. And what comes up in our newsfeed? Which of the people in our social networks messages reach us, and who do we reach? Increasingly, these are being decided by these kind of predictive machine learning algorithms.
Sounds like there's no escaping it. So I think we should probably talk about what it is we're actually talking about when we talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence.
I think, yeah, so what I'm hearing is artificial intelligence. It's very much like what one might consider human intelligence. It just happens with machines, and it could be decision making, it could be learning, it could be anything. It could be assistive, or it could be a replacement for a human intelligence making these assessment decisions, like for loans or policing or things like that. We have Julia actually prepared some materials for us, and I think we're going to take a look a little bit deeper down under the hood and take a look at a little bit more detail about what is AI as I'm looking at the slides. Thank you, Julia, for putting that up. And you have slides and sort of a selection from a comic book. You're going to take us through a little bit more what is AI and hopefully a bit about how exactly it works. Are you ready?
Yes, and please confirm that you're seeing my slides and not the notes.
We
also.
are seeing your slides. And
okay, great, great. So hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Julia Stoyanovich. I'm a computer scientist and a data scientist on the faculty at New York University. And I will do my absolute best to give you a very quick overview of what artificial intelligence is. So the promise of AI, of course, is that because of the convergence of unprecedented data collection capabilities, enormous computational power and broad acceptance of data collection and analysis as a way to move society forward, there is an opportunity to do a lot of good. We can use AI to accelerate scientific discovery in a variety of areas, from astrophysics to medicine. We can boost innovation, from self-driving cars to advertisement targeting and back. We can improve society by improving how governments function, by helping make resource distribution more equitable, and bringing greater transparency and accountability to government operations, potentially with the help of AI. And perhaps most importantly, we can get AI to do all of our work so we can just sit back and relax at the beach. But before we rejoice at the possibilities, let's actually step back and unpack this term AI. What is artificial intelligence anyway? Consider the task that many of us attempted with mixed results during the COVID-19 lockdown, and that is baking sourdough bread. I will use this task as my running example to discuss algorithms, data, and decisions. So here's an algorithm. Prep, buy ingredients, measure them, mix. Mix is combine yeast, flour, and water, cover, and wait for the dough to rise. Then knead, shape the dough, wait some more, and repeat as needed. And finally, we bake. The algorithm is this recipe that I just outlined. It lists the steps that we take to transform ingredients into a loaf of bread. The algorithm may be fully prescribed. It may list exactly what ingredients to get, exactly how much to take of each ingredient, and really it may spell out every step by step, at what temperature to bake, how long to wait for the dough to rise, etc. These algorithms we call rule-based. If we know the rules well enough to write them down, and if we can always get exactly the same ingredients, then every time we will bake a great loaf of sourdough. But we may or may not actually have information about the rules that are needed for making a good loaf of sourdough to begin with. And we may also want to see some variety in the outcomes. And so as an alternative to a rule-based algorithm, we can have an algorithm that learns to bake. How does this work? Well, we will keep the structure of the recipe the same as is outlined here, but we will try different combinations of ingredients, mixing and kneading techniques, wait times, and baking temperature and time. And then we may ask a person, do you like how the sourdough came out? And if so, we may keep these settings, or we may try something slightly different or a lot different and see which results we like better. And from this, we can figure out what ingredients and what combinations of parameters work well together. So far, we discussed the algorithms piece here. Now, what about the data? Data comes in multiple forms. One form is the combination of ingredients we take as input. Another form of data is the parameters of this recipe. And then there's also data that describes the output, the loaf that we baked. How much does it weigh? Is it chewy on the inside and crusty on the outside? What is its nutritional value? These are some objectively measurable factors. The final and perhaps most important kind of data here is human judgment. Did the loaf come out well enough to eat? Is it tasty? Are we giving it a thumbs up or a thumbs down? This data is the subjective feedback that we get on the output, and it's very often more important than these objective properties that we can measure. Having talked about the algorithm and the data, now what about decisions? In the process we described, a human is making a decision every time that the algorithm is executed, every time that a loaf is baked. A decision that is more consequential than giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down to a particular loaf is, now that we've tried a bunch of recipes and a bunch of data combinations, which will we consider a success? Will we decide to always or never use some specific ingredients or some specific parameters? Will we say that it's more important to have an appetizing looking loaf or one that consistently comes out as chewy on the inside and crusty on the outside? A more consequential decision yet is, do we think that we've tried out enough recipes to pass our experience onto a machine and trust the machine to bake on our behalf? Will we trust the machine to bake something different, like baguettes? What about trusting it to make judgments on our behalf, deciding which baked goods come out well and which did not come out well? How much autonomy do we give to a machine, a learning algorithm, an AI? So what is an AI? I would characterize it as a system in which algorithms use data and make decisions on our behalf, or help us, humans, make decisions. An example of AI is Roomba, a robot that helps us clean. Roomba is a great autonomously vacuuming machine. And it's one of the first victories of classical rule-based AI. It's the stuff of textbooks. The decisions that a Roomba makes are, what's a good strategy to clean an entire room that it may not have seen before? How should it be mapping out the room, and what next move should it take? Should it go left, right, or turn around? Another example of a highly successful AI is IBM's Deep Blue that beat Garry Kasparov, the legendary grandmaster, at chess in 1997. Several systems followed, including AlphaZero, that taught itself chess from basic rules. This success, being able to learn a very complex game starting from basic rules, is one of the holy grails of AI. The decisions in chess are more complex than those that Roomba makes, but they are similar in that they are strategic. What's a good overall strategy to take? What's a meaningful next move? And how would we respond and adjust our strategy in response to the decisions and moves of the opponent? But now enter another application of AI, its use in hiring. The decisions that we're asking an AI to make here are very different from those that are made by Roomba and by Deep Blue. We are asking it to predict who will do well on the job and who will not do well. And the big question here is, can an AI succeed at this task that amounts to predicting social outcomes? How do we know whether it has succeeded? How do we measure success? And do we want an AI to be making such predictions at all? Do we consider this to be ethical? So just a little bit more about hiring. Since the 1990s, and increasingly so lately, commercial tools are being used by companies, large and small, to hire more efficiently, source and screen candidates faster and with less paperwork, and then select candidates who presumably will do better or well on the job. These tools are meant to improve efficiency for the job applicants as well, not only for the employers, allowing them to apply with a click of a button, matching them with relevant positions, and facilitating the interview process. The hiring process has aptly been described as a funnel. It starts when employers source candidates by placing job ads. Candidates are then screened, their resumes are parsed. Then interviews are conducted also with the help of these automated tools. During the selection stage, employers will make final hiring and compensation determinations with the help of AI. And then there's also, of course, a background checks stage that also very often is algorithm and data assisted. So importantly, data and predictive analytics, what I have been casually denoting as AI, are used during each one of these stages. And as stated by Jenny Yang, former commissioner of the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, automated hiring systems act as modern gatekeepers to economic opportunity. We have been seeing things going very badly wrong with the use of these systems, however, and perhaps I will leave some of this to a discussion that we will have together, but we have indication of gender-based discrimination in job ad placement. We have seen examples of resume parsers exhibiting bias against women, downgrading resumes that mention the word women's, like women's chess club captain. There are also prominent examples of discrimination based on disability status by online personality tests. And the final example I'll mention here is that during background checks, if you Google with an African-American sounding name, Google will serve you ads suggestive of a criminal record far more frequently than if you Google with a white sounding name. And this happens even if you control for whether the person in fact has a criminal record. To summarize, we are concerned very much with the use of AI tools in hiring, and the kinds of concerns that we have relate to discrimination. Discrimination itself is often linked to the term bias, and this is a term that we use a lot, but that we don't understand very well.
Well, before we talk about bias, maybe
Okay.
I had a few questions about what you've said so far.
Sure.
So you're saying that a Roomba and a chess-playing genius AI are both worthy of being called AI?
Absolutely. AI is not something that is synonymous with machine learning. Machine learning is a kind of an AI system, right? But really, we have very, very prominent examples of AI systems, artificial intelligence systems that are rule-based. Now, the truth is that the more successful systems today, whether they are something like Roomba or something more complex, they do use a combination of rules that are defined kind of upfront and are top-down in a sense, and some form of learning.
Well, our department is tasked with teaching people. We offer classes in programming and things like that. So I was wondering whether or not you could tell us if somebody were interested in learning a little bit about how, or getting their sort of feet wet with AI, what kind of languages or technologies would they have to learn in order to sort of understand this better?
There are lots of tools that are available to us today that allow us really to get a sense of how machines might learn even without any programming. But if you wanted to get your feet wet with actual coding experience, Python is one of the more popular languages these days, and there are lots of open source libraries in Python that are fairly easy to get started with. So I think, frankly, Python is sort of the lingua franca today of any of this work.
And I could just jump in on that, Julia, if you don't mind. I think
yes, of course.
it also in terms of, just the language, you have to understand that what ultimately what we're talking about is a form of computer science, right? Like AI is a a field of study within computer science. And so the question of how do you get started in AI is basically how do you get started in computer science? And right now in the world, right, there's the traditional route of people who study computer science in undergrad at a 4-year college. And then there are some people that are completely self-trained. So I'll give you an example. I studied computer science in undergrad. My younger brother studied programming online just by lurking on, on forums, right? And he can code circles around me. And he's never spent a day in a classroom, right? He could probably teach, computer science, 1 or 2 class just because of he's studied it in his room, finding stuff on YouTube, finding tutorials. So I think there are those 2 traditional paths, like academia and then that sort of self-training. But now there are so many of these boot camps, right, that are like 5, 6-week intense like coding boot camps offered through stuff like General Assembly, and there's other online materials like through Coursera, and that provide you sort of a structured learning environment that is really starting to sort of short circuit some of the traditional 4-year entry points into computer science. Within, you can get into actual AI development within that world. So I think that the space of education is really being democratized in a lot of way in terms of the access points to these things.
Yeah, there's a lot of there are a lot of courses, right? I mean, we teach classes in Python and stuff like that, and yeah, you can sort of find a lot online. There's all kinds of good websites and camps and stuff like that. It still takes a bit of time to learn, though, right?
Absolutely. And sorry to jump in. The reason that I started by explaining what an algorithm is because that is really a fundamental notion. As Eric says, AI, no matter whether it's machine learning or if it's rule-based, this is an area of computer science. And the basic component of computational thinking is understanding algorithms. And algorithms is something that we encounter in our daily lives, right? So this is what this example is meant to illustrate, that when you bake, when you get ready for work in the morning, you already are executing a sequence of steps that is regular in some sense, right? So this is kind of the basics of computational thinking, and therefore of starting to understand AI systems.
Does this involve a lot of math? I'm thinking that when you can, I'm not sure about the Roomba, but I feel like if an AI was trying to figure out something about a photograph, they would have to translate that into some kind of number or numbers. So are all these models sort of just crunching a lot of numbers and sort of spitting out results? Is it fair to say that all of them rely a lot on this kind of process?
It depends on what types of tasks you are asking the machine to undertake, right? So if indeed you are asking a machine to learn from data, then there's going to be statistical reasoning involved. It's going to be looking for patterns in the data. But rule-based programs are logical rules. There doesn't necessarily actually have to be statistical reasoning that is involved in that.
Awesome, thank you.
Brian, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways of thinking about it. One is if you want to think about actually becoming a practitioner yourself, in which case, I think having some familiarity with what the actual algorithms are is obviously indispensable. But I think as citizens, we're sort of in a different position as well, which is, trying to make inferences about these systems that affect us, whether it's the Twitter newsfeed or, our credit score or whatever it might be, in a situation where we don't have access to the actual internals of the system. And we just have to sort of make these, judgments about what relationship the data that this entity has about us, what relationship exists between that and the ultimate decision that gets made. And so I think there's a very different process of education that needs to take place in these sort of citizen applications as opposed to the practitioner applications. Obviously, the two can go hand in hand, but it's, there's a very different perspective depending on which angle you want to take.
I would disagree with that actually slightly. And I think that it's very important for us to demystify AI to people and to be able to explain what AI cannot do. We need to explain what it is. And all it is a set of logical rules, right? That looks at data. Absolutely, Brian. This is perhaps the most important thing. And that then makes decisions based on that data and based on its reasoning capabilities. But ultimately, it's an engineering device, right? So whatever we program it to do, that's what it does. It does not have discretion. It does not have a sense of humor. It's much dumber than a person in that sense, right? It's a mechanical device. And so by showing that it is algorithmic, that it follows a sequence of steps that you give it, you really underscore its limitations also. It does what you program it to do. It responds to objectives.
And that's terrific. And I think the other thing too, I always like Kathy O'Neill's point that she made in the book, Weapons of Math Destruction. And she says that algorithms are opinions encoded in math, right? It's so Julia's example of baking bread, right? My algorithm for baking bread might be different than Safiya's. It might be different than Brian's. But because I am, and this is the way the society works, is because I am a programmer, or I had the privilege of studying math and computer science, I am placed in institutions where my ability to translate my opinion into code supersedes your opinion, because I am put into this position to have this encoded in my role in an institution like Google or Apple, or even like the ways that like our governments are starting to use these technologies. So I think that's a really great point. But the fact that ultimately the math and the actual coding is taking someone's opinion on how something should work is the key thing that I think everyone should always keep in the back of their mind.
Yes, thank you. And speaking of how AI is used in institutions, I think we should probably talk about policing. So this is a simultaneously fascinating and terrifying subject. I think many of you will remember the Philip K. Dick story, Minority Report, which got made into a movie with Tom Cruise, where he uses AI and he figures out when crime is going to happen. But predictive policing is actually something that is used currently. So Brian, you have a whole chapter about a particular algorithm, but maybe you could set the stage for us first by telling us how widespread is the use of predictive policing in the United States. For example, do a lot of major city police departments use it?
Yes, and in fact, increasingly we're seeing bills getting passed both at the state and federal level, mandating the use of algorithmic systems to do things like pretrial and bail and so forth. So there are many, many different ways in which AI systems get used in criminal justice. They get used in terms of predicting where actual police should patrol. They get involved in when you are arraigned and your trial date is set. Are you released pending your trial, or are you detained pending your trial, or is your bail set and for what amount? They're used for decisions like probation and parole. Are you going to be released early versus serve out the entirety of your sentence? So almost every part of the criminal justice pipeline that you can imagine, there is a growing use of these kind of statistical and algorithmic risk assessment instruments. And this has a almost 100-year long history. It goes back to Chicago's parole system in the late 1920s. But it is really in the last, I would say, 20 years that this has accelerated. And so the question of whether these systems are quote unquote fair has really emerged as, I think, one of the central issues in the area of algorithms in criminal justice.
One algorithm that's gained a lot of notoriety because it's made it into the papers is called Compass. Can you tell us sort of what that is? What does the acronym stand for, or what does it do, and how does it sort of do its job of like rating people or whatever it does?
Yeah. So the Compass system is the most widely, if I'm not mistaken, most widely used pretrial risk assessment tool. It is sometimes used for other things, but it is mainly intended to be used for that. And it has been the subject of, I would say, the greatest amount of scrutiny in this entire area. So part of what I think has been interesting from my perspective is to follow the kind of pivot of public opinion on the Compass tool itself specifically. So if you go back to 2014, 2015, you'd be reading in the New York Times editorial board saying things like, New York City has to get with the 21st century. We're making these pretrial decisions and these parole decisions using these subjective, unreviewable criteria. Judges are just kind of doing whatever they want, and then we can't audit those decisions after the fact. We need something that's evidence-based. We need something that's consistent, that's transparent. We need a tool like Compass. Compass has been proven in other jurisdictions to work. It's time for us to kind of catch up with the times. Then suddenly in 2016, you see this abrupt about face where the New York Times is publishing these articles talking about people being, jailed by an algorithm or, held in jail, unfairly because of this algorithm. And the public sentiment turns basically 180 degrees against Compass. The main driver, I would say, of that change was an investigation done in 2016 by Julia Angwin and a team of reporters at ProPublica that looked at a data set of predictions that the Compass tool had made about whether defendants were likely to either miss their court appointment or commit additional offenses pending their trial date. And whether they, in fact, did go on to commit additional offenses, or at least to be rearrested. And that gap ends up being critical, which we'll come back to. But what they found was that, on the one hand, if you looked at this data set, which was from Broward County, Florida, the Compass predictions were equally accurate for Black defendants and white defendants. And in particular, they were what's called calibrated, meaning that if you were assigned, let's say, a risk score of 8 out of 10, then you were just as likely to go on to reoffend, whether or not you were Black or white. However, if you look at the cases where the Compass system was incorrect, you see these huge disparities between Black defendants and white defendants. So in particular, you see a false positive rate for Black defendants that's almost twice that of white defendants. And so this kicked off a huge controversy that spilled into the public. It spilled into the legal arena and among policymakers, and also into the theoretical computer science community. And people started to say, okay, we have these different mathematical definitions of what a fair system should be. The theoretical computer science community comes back and says, okay, it turns out to be mathematically impossible to satisfy all of these definitions at the same time. And so what do we do? And there's a very complicated public policy conversation to be had on those points. But I think zooming out, I think from my perspective, the Compass story really tells us, I think, 4 things. I think there are 4 main questions that we need to be asking when we think about systems like this as they're actually used in society. The first is there's often a gap between what we can measure and what we're actually trying to predict. And so this is what I mentioned earlier. The tool is designed to predict quote unquote recidivism or nonviolent and violent offenses, but we can't measure crime. We can only measure arrests and convictions. And if there's a gap between people that are arrested versus people that actually commit crimes, then you have a problem because you're actually predicting rearrest rather than crime itself. Now, this is something that, going back to the 1930s, conservatives were arguing that, it wasn't fair that just because someone was a criminal mastermind and evaded arrest, then they get tagged in the database as having been, reformed, and it recommends releasing more people like that. These days, in the 21st century, you're much more likely to hear the critique coming from progressives saying, now, wait a minute, just because someone is wrongfully arrested or wrongfully convicted, they're getting tagged into the database as a bad person, and the model is going to recommend detaining more people like that. So the political valence has shifted over time, but the nature of the critique, I think, is the same, which is just that we can't actually measure the thing we're trying to predict. So the second thing is, are we actually using the model for what it's designed for? Compass is designed for pretrial detention and parole. It's explicitly not designed for sentencing. And in fact, it says, don't use this for sentencing, but some jurisdictions use it for sentencing anyway. And so I think there's a really important ethical question there about the use of models, essentially off-label use, using them in ways they weren't designed for. I think that's extremely important. The third question is, what is the intervention that this model is actually trying to support? So, for example, one of the predictions that the Compass tool makes is a defendant's risk of failing to appear for their court date. Now, implicitly, that prediction is used to detain that person in jail or to give them a really high bail or something like this. But there's a growing body of research, for example, that says that merely reminding someone of their court date with a text message is extremely effective. And so there's this question beyond the predictive accuracy of the model, which is, I think, very ethically critical, which is what do we do with that prediction? Do we say this person is a 7 out of 10 risk to fail to appear for their court appointment, therefore we need to incarcerate them? Or do we just need to send them a reminder? So I think that's an incredibly important question. And then finally, I think there's this meta question, which is, do we really want our criminal justice system to be predictive based at all? And so you are seeing this movement, including in New York State, to kind of, in a blanket way, eliminate pretrial detention for nonviolent misdemeanor offenses and just say, wait a minute, the whole philosophical premise of the justice system is that you're innocent until proven guilty. Therefore, if you're arrested for, nonviolent misdemeanor, let's not even go there. Let's not even make this statistical prediction about what we think you might do in the future, Minority Report style, to use that metaphor. Let's just not go there at all. Let's just release everyone. And so that is, I think, an increasing response to some of these tools. But it's a very, very nuanced and complicated discussion. But I think those are, from my perspective, some of the key questions that we need to be asking about the use of this software.
So I've heard a term replacement AI and another term called augmentation AI, where replacement AI means AI that, as Julia was saying, could replace a human's decision and actually has the authority to do that. Whereas augmentation AI means AI that's kind of your little helper, that maybe offers a second opinion, maybe a contrasting opinion. In Compass situations, like what was the actual fallout? I mean, were people relying on this so heavily, like even the judges were so wowed by it that they just ordered like whatever bail was recommended by the algorithm? Or was it ever sort of mediated by, the people with criminal, judges and lawyers? So how much did people actually use it? How much weight did it carry?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and indeed from judge to judge. I think in this area, there is a critical need for some kind of oversight, right? You would shudder to imagine just putting the entire criminal justice system on some kind of autopilot, right? There's evidence that it often, predictive policing in particular, can create these kind of self-fulfilling prophecies, these sort of feedback loops where you send more police to a particular neighborhood, they find more crime, therefore you deploy more police, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, I think in almost every part of the criminal justice system, broadly speaking, some kind of human in the loop is indispensable. I think the question from my perspective is, does that person actually have the technical literacy to meaningfully interpret the risk scores that they get and to know when to override those scores or not? So I attended a number of arraignment hearings where I live in San Francisco, just a week or two after San Francisco began using what's called the Arnold tool, which is the risk assessment that we use here. And it was very interesting for me hearing the judges talk about these score sheets that they're given. And some of them, I think, felt more empowered to understand what was happening than others. I think for many judges, there's this deference to technology that, okay, well, I'm being given this piece of paper, there's a giant red bar on the top and it says you're an 8 out of 10. That sounds pretty bad. Therefore, I'm just going to, lock you up because it says, moderately risky, and that sounds bad. I think there's a real need. I mean, going back to some of your earlier questions and some of our earlier conversation about education and literacy, I think there is a huge need for people who have, if you've been sitting on the bench for 25 years, maybe you never thought that your job was going to require you to understand how machine learning systems work and, develop an intuition for when a particular defendant might be the kind of person where the risk assessment doesn't apply and you need to make an exception, et cetera. So I think we do need that kind of actual education. And it's also, I think, incumbent on the people that design these systems to design them in ways that are maximally transparent and interpretable and make their limitations as clear as possible.
So I want to recap just a couple of the different things that you said here, and we're going to lay this as the discussion for our final future direction section. So I think you brought up a lot of good points that we want to jump in on. So the first one being that in Compass, we're asking, if we're creating these algorithms, are we getting the right data to create these algorithms, right? So if you're creating a policing algorithm, you're not actually targeting crime with your data, you're targeting arrests. And as we know, arrests don't necessarily equal the crime that has been, right, the crime itself. And so if we have police that have their own biases, or racism, and then we use that data to create a policing system, we're just replicating that social system and putting it into installing it, plugging it into an algorithm by creating an algorithm using that data. So I think the data is a point. Also, your point about how it's applied, and right, are we applying it in the way that we expect it to be applied? And then the other comment that you brought up about structural changes, are we using these algorithms, right? So it's one thing to be able to Minority Report style foresee where crime might be and swoop in and try to identify where these hotspots are. But I remember a particular point in your book that I think is really sort of stuck with me is maybe instead of trying to imagine where crime would be and say this is where it is and swoop in and arrest the person as it happens, maybe we should be thinking of some structural changes as opposed to trying to do the project of bolstering policing in the first place. And so these are some really big social and ethical questions that come up alongside these questions of how the algorithms themselves are designed and then how they're applied in society. We want to shift gears a little bit and talk with Safiya Noble, who has joined us. She wrote a book on algorithms. It's called Algorithms of Oppression, and she talks about some of the same artificial intelligences, but applied to the way that we access pretty much all of the knowledge that we have. There's sort of this idea that search algorithms out there bring out sort of this neutral collection of all of the knowledge that humans could generate and have access to, and that it's presented in an unbiased way. And she really challenges those assumptions in her book, and then digs into what's at stake here and what could happen if those algorithms are not as objective as we think they are. And she looks at how racism and sexism and bias can be compounded by some of the algorithms that we've created. So Safiya, we wanted to dig into your research a little bit. Can you tell us about your process for researching for algorithms of oppression? I read somewhere that you spent 6 years actually searching for information to write this book. What initiated this study into algorithms for search engines?
Thanks, Jenna. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm a huge fan of the public library, and as a person who works and trains librarians and future information knowledge professionals, it's just it's a delight to get to be a part of this conversation. I really appreciate hearing from my colleagues up until till now, and to participate in this conversation about what algorithms are, what AI is. And I think for many people, they will never have the experience of becoming programmers and may never even indeed be interested in programming, but they will engage and encounter with all kinds of technologies that are kind of that seem, we've heard some words already today, this afternoon and this evening, like magic, magical. We've heard words like hard to understand or rules-based technologies. And, for many people, how we come to experience these things are something as banal as a Google search. And, I was really interested in thinking about our everyday technology engagements in these places that we don't even kind of give a second thought to, that we don't really dig into more deeply, and to see what the stakes are in those places. So, when I first started this work, yes, I this book is an outgrowth of a dissertation that I wrote while I was getting my PhD at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I started it in 2010. So here we are 11 years later. And, a decade ago, if we were having this conversation, for example, about whether technology could discriminate, whether it held biases, as Julia was, starting to kind of get into in her presentation, it was almost impossible to apprehend that conversation. The majority of people, even computer scientists a decade ago, would say that it's impossible for computer code to discriminate because code is just math and math can't be racist, right? And there's still a few quarters where people might argue that, but I think what we have now is a much, much more sophisticated understanding of that. In the same way that we wouldn't say to be human is simply to be a cell and mitochondria, we cannot be hyper reductionist about what AI or what algorithms or technology are, because we're talking about the context of sociality, the context of being human and our human engagement. So it's really where technology and people come into contact, and of course, understanding technology as also a human expression. So I was really interested when I started looking 10 years ago, and I found that every time you did keyword searches, for example, on a variety of different identities, if you looked at Black girls, Latina girls, Asian girls, you would get back a page full of pornography on the first page in Google search, and also other commercial search engines. But of course, I was mostly interested in Google because at the time, and maybe even still today, Google really was emerging as a huge threat to how people came to understand and find knowledge. Before commercial search engines, we had a different kind of Web 1.0 experience. We organized knowledge in ways that were far more transparent. We actually called the kind of early directories on the internet virtual libraries. We understood that there were subject matter experts, librarians in particular, and other kinds of like DIY hobbyists, people who had a lot of teachers, people who knew things that were clustering and trying to organize information for us. And we had a lot of more transparency that people were involved. And of course, at the time that I started looking and finding all of these really what I found to be incredibly destructive, racist, and sexist stereotypes about women and girls in search engines, I realized that as I was talking about that, I was speaking almost into a void. People would say, well, it's just the user error. You didn't search right. Right? This was kind of the logic. And of course, now fast forward 10 years with all the many examples that have been brought up on this call and many beyond and many more that I document in the book, what we see is that we are engaging with all kinds of, let's say, rules of engagement by which AI or algorithms are designed into very complex societies, complex social historical relationships that cannot account for, in simple terms, mitigating something like a history of racist stereotypes. So when people say, well, if you get racism or sexism back in a search engine, it's because that's what people are looking for. But of course, one of the challenges that I offer back is that even today, if you look for Asian girls and Latina girls, you don't have to add the word sex or porn. Those identities become synonymous. And of course, that lives in a long history of hypersexualizing girls of color, children of color, of using and kind of weaponizing women as sex objects to justify our disenfranchisement, quite frankly, in society. So, I think there's a lot to think about. And even if you don't really care about like programming and the technical dimensions of how we got here, I think it's very important to understand as you use and engage with these technologies, what's at stake. And I will tell you that tech companies spend billions of dollars to obfuscate the impact and the import of the work that they do and the way in which they're reshaping our social experience. Right. And I think we have a tremendous amount at stake, including, threats to other kinds of knowledge organizations like libraries and schools and universities and teachers and the knowledge that parents have. I mean, I'll tell you, talk to parents right now and anybody who's got a child under 18. if that child trusts what their parent thinks about a topic or what Google says about it. We all have these kinds of, anecdotal experiences we can point to. And I think this is one of the reasons why we have to look much more closely at what these systems are and how they have such an outsized influence increasingly in our society.
Speaking to that, there's one very outsized and tragic incident that you mentioned in your book, and it has to do with Dylan Roof and the brutal murders of 9 people in Charleston in the year 2015. Can you go through a little bit about what you found in your research, especially vis-a-vis search engines?
Well, sure. I mean, one of the things that was really a tragedy and that we learned from Dylan Roof in his own words was that he was trying to make sense of the reporting that was happening around Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, which was really in the news. And for those of you who might recall, after George Zimmerman murdered Trayvon Martin, and Trayvon Martin really being kind of the moving spirit of the Black Lives Matter movement, it was there was surveys that were happening all over the country where when you asked Black Americans what they thought about whether there would be justice for Trayvon Martin, overwhelmingly Black people, African Americans said, no, there would not be, that, George Zimmerman deserved to go to prison and be held accountable for the murder of Trayvon Martin. And when white Americans were surveyed, they overwhelmingly said that George Zimmerman did the right thing. He was in the right. And, he should not be convicted. Now, this was happening in real time in the world. And here comes Dylan Roof, who says in his own words in his manifesto that he's trying to make sense of all this news reporting, because this is a headline news every night. And he starts doing Google searches. And one of the things that happens as he's doing Google searches is he gets tripped up into a whole kind of bevy of white supremacist websites. And these white supremacist websites, they're what Jessie Daniels, who wrote this amazing book called Cyber Racism. She's a professor in the CUNY system and somebody whose work is so important at Hunter College. She says these cloaked websites, they look like they could be maybe a legitimate news organization or some type of nonprofit news source. Well, he comes across all these kinds of cloaked websites, and what they are just thinly veiled white supremacist and white nationalist organizations. And so Dylan Roof goes down a rabbit hole, and then he, in his own words, reports out about learning about the Jewish problem, learning about, all of these violent attacks that African Americans are committing against white Americans, which I can guarantee you that is not true. And we all know what the consequences would be. And we would never stop hearing about that. So what we know, in fact, is that violent crime is an intra-racial phenomenon. White Americans die at the hands of other white Americans, and the crime happens within community. So, Dylan Roof, he says that by doing these Google searches and going and finding all this information, he becomes completely racially aware. And this is the pretext for his open fire and murder of 9 African Americans who are unsuspecting at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. So I give that example in the book because I want people to understand that, when you are looking for something banal, hey, what time does Starbucks close? No problem, probably pretty reliable. When you start asking something like a search engine, complex questions about society, about people, about communities, now we're into some dangerous territory. And this is one of the things that I think is a huge misnomer, is this idea that AI or artificial intelligence or search engines are somehow smarter than human beings, right? I mean, this is where I live in LA, and the Hollywood version of AI, just makes me want to whip my computer across the room, because I know that these are just, fantasy narratives. Julia gave us such a great lesson on what AI is. It is not this it can be sophisticated, but it is not, in fact, even intelligent. It is following the instructions or the recipe that people put in. And I will tell you quite frankly that a very limited small set of people in our society get to make those rules and get to implement those rules. And those are things we should care about deeply.
So algorithms often sort of, these seemingly neutral search engine algorithms often interact with communities of color in sort of not so beneficial ways, as you were pointing out. And there's another story in your book where, again, this goes back to your point about the system not being intelligent, because there's a story in your book about a hairstylist and sort of her grappling with Yelp in terms of how it portrayed her business. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what it illustrates about algorithms again?
Sure. Well, one of the cases that I closed the book with is a story about a Black hairstylist who, is a middle-aged woman who's been doing Black hair, the women, Black women's hair in her community for 30 years, and all of a sudden in her community, young women are not finding her business because she is going to now be responsible for somehow having like a significant web presence. She's not a web designer. She does hair. She's not interested in doing that. She has to spend thousands of dollars to make herself visible. She's trying to figure out, because Black hair care is a word of mouth business. But, she's now meeting up with a generation of young women who don't go to church and ask that, who does your hair. They're in a very small, kind of predominantly white community. It's very hard for her to kind of use the word of mouth that she'd used for 30 years. And so she turns to Yelp. And one of the things that she finds as she's having to make herself visible in Yelp is that there are all these kinds of rules in this system that work against her. So for example, she's trying to designate and use words like Black hair care to describe her business. And Yelp is putting her in Yelp jail and suspending her account and telling her that she cannot use the word Black because that's racist, that there can be no racial or ethnic kinds of identification in the way that she markets her business. Now, anybody who's Black knows that there are a couple things we're not going to do. We're not going to not get our hair done by other Black people, and we're probably not going to get buried by people who aren't Black. We're going to have funeral homes and barbershops and beauty shops for us. That's just how it is. So she's frozen out of her ability to market her business in Yelp based on the core of what her business is. Then she learns that she's got to pay like this is like some old school on the block mafia. She's got to pay to get her competitors taken down off of her page in Yelp, right? She's got to shell it out. And what she finds is that when she looks at her page, white hair care businesses are getting put up as her competition. And she's like, that's actually not even my competition set. So now it's confusing what's going on here. I think she has no remedies, no recourse. Every time she's trying to struggle through this platform, she gets nowhere. And I think this is really important because one of the things that we know is that these kinds of recommendation engines increasingly either make you invisible, or in the case of Google's latest effort to make Black-owned businesses visible, right? Tagging and marking Black-owned businesses makes them so hyper visible that white supremacists and racists come and give them one-star reviews to, again, make them invisible, right? So this just happened in the news a couple of weeks ago. Happy Black History Month, everyone. So I think these are the kinds of things that when we talk about turning over so much of like economic prosperity, right, visibility, what can happen to small businesses into these spaces, there's quite a bit, at stake. And this is one of the things I try to do is humanize these stories. It's more than just like generic search terms. It's an actual woman who's responsible for taking care of her family and keeping her business alive, and who is a huge cultural asset in her community.
Wow, thank you for sharing those stories. One of the biggest things I think that you're pointing out here, right, is some of the problems that we might see in papering over race and identity in the algorithms. And we're saying, oh, this is actually a topic that we brought up in our chat yesterday that I thought was really a really concise and valuable way to think about this is sometimes if we're saying that, oh yeah, it's for the greater good, and we ask the question, who is the greater good, you're automatically eliminating minorities. You're saying just the majority, like by definition, that doesn't include minority voices. And these instances are very, very, very striking and very sort of comprehensible, digestible instances where you can say, exactly, that really went wrong there, and that really affected a particular minority by and cut off their voice.
Yeah, and let me add, there are certain cultural practices that are not normative across every culture. So one of the things, for example, that Candace helps us understand in this situation, in this case, is that her customers aren't going to check in and report out in Yelp where they are in real time or even later. Because guess what? Black women don't want to report out necessarily that we're at the beauty shop getting our hair did. You know what I'm saying? This is nobody's business. And so they experience like having to use those kinds of check-in functions or leaving a review function as a form of surveillance, and they don't want it known. Sometimes people don't want to tell who the great stylist is because they don't want everybody to come to them because they want to be able to get an appointment. See, there's lots of reasons why someone's amazing and you don't want to tell everyone either. But the logics of the platform, because when she started asking people, well, listen, let me get my customers to leave reviews because maybe that will help me get more visibility and be found. Because she doesn't traditionally have a lot of people doing that, she goes back to Yelp jail again, gets her account suspended again, because now people think these are fraudulent that are working on the customer service side. So it's just like a no wins, like no matter how the rules exist, they're interpreted against her. And I think this lack of cultural nuance, this lack of context of what these systems are, how to be seen in them, but how to be forgotten in them as well. These are major issues that are happening around the world that we are talking about, and they have serious consequences for people. In some cases, you know, when we start talking about the way a search engine records you, misrepresents you, makes visible false information about you that you can't get taken down. I mean, we don't have a right to be forgotten law in the United States yet. And those things can have serious consequences on whether you get a job, whether you get into college, you know, whether somebody wants to date you, all kinds of things. And I think we have to get very serious about looking at these systems and the outsized role that they play in our lives.
Yeah, so we're seeing this big disconnect between what the systems look like and how they're built, and the needs and the nuanced cultural needs that we have with our complex society and our complex, very diverse identities. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and bat some questions to Eric, who actually studies the relationship between individuals and AI and individuals and their local city governments, sometimes mediated by AI. Eric, I know your research is on building these trustworthy relationships between AI systems and individual users and the local city government. What are the factors that would affect an individual and population trust of AI and trust of their government as it's using these AI systems?
Yeah, so I would just say first that as far as trust in like private sector use of AI, I think if you read anything that Safiya ever has written, then you know that the ship has sailed on that, right? That's a wrap. And this is, I'm someone who, you know, formerly interned at Google, and so it hurts me to say that, but it is what it is. So private sector trust, I don't think is a thing. I think we have to come back, and a lot of what I did during my PhD was like read about like the moral philosophy of trust and what it actually means. And I think that in the current ways that we use that term, we have sort of washed it of what it really comes down to, which is about power and vulnerability and mutual vulnerability, right? The idea that trust is this making yourself is a grant of power over yourself, allowing yourself to accept some vulnerability in expectation that someone is going to act on your behalf in goodwill, right? So as it pertains to trust in local government and trust in technology, we have ceded our the power that we allow these technology companies to have over us in these relationships because of these unequal power dynamics, right? How are they making themselves vulnerable to us, right? If trust is this mutual exchange of vulnerability, if I give you some type of authority over me, how are you making yourself vulnerable? Are you making yourself vulnerable through disclosing everything that you're doing? Are you making yourself vulnerable in terms of giving me direct accountability mechanisms? So I'll give you in as far as it pertains to city government. I mean, there's a lack of imagination, I think. So even right now in New York, based off of the ADS task force, which came out of a bill that de Blasio's wrote, well, he agreed to in 2018. Well, one aspect of this larger hiring bill was the idea of creating an algorithmic management and policy office. So this is an office. It's called AMPO. You can Google it. And its job in New York is to look at how all of the city governments, how all of the different entities within this city government are using algorithms. So NYCHA, NYPD, they released a report online of what entities in the city are using these algorithms. So they made this report. Who is the audience for that, right? Are they going out and trying to reach you and directly translate this to you in a way that is tangible, in a way to bring you closer to government, in a way that you can hold government accountable? Not so much right now, right? And being very reluctant to release this information at the same time, right? They're not necessarily trying to put themselves in a state of mutual vulnerability with you. So I think in order for us to have this conversation about trust, we have to be holding people, we have to be expecting this mutual vulnerability. And outside of that, we're just ceding power over ourselves.
That leads us into sort of our final questions that we're going to ask you all, and we're interested in the idea of how we can reimagine this future and roles of AI in society. We raised a lot of different questions about its application, about how it's built, about the relationships between the creators of AI, the installers of AI, so the authority and the city government. And we also raised questions about the users and how you could be an informed user or an uninformed user of AI. And we're asking civic questions, we're asking ethical questions. So we want to sort of reopen the floor and talk about what you all, and whoever wants to speak next, what you imagine as a trajectory forward from this point, now that we've diagnosed a lot of these problems with AI, particularly with the way AI handles minority groups of race, minority groups of gender, minority groups of ability. And we want to know what you think, what you think a path forward would be from this point. Pejin, did you have something to say?
I could jump in and say that, one of the things that, Safiya didn't get to talk about, I know I've read her book, I'm a big fan of her book, is the extent to which these large tech companies are starting to play roles in democratic roles in our society in a way that are problematic, because you have here you have a private company that's beholden to their shareholders, right, and whatever the objectives of their company are, but they're affecting how we live and act in a democracy, but they're not held to democratic sort of mechanisms for accountability. So one way forward is this movement toward sort of democratizing right? This technology. So you can see stuff like the hiring bill in New York, right, which needs some work. I'm sure Julia can elaborate on that. But then you have cities that are like Portland. I think it was Portland, Brian, that just banned like all facial recognition. So you see this movement toward sort of democratizing these systems. So I think that's one interesting way forward. You have in Europe the GDPR. So I think that the EU is probably the most progressive in terms of thinking about the ways in which the AI can be democratized. And I think I would say nationally we are way behind on that. Last 4 years, did it help? I won't say why or who that had anything to do with in the White House, but hopefully there's a lot of interesting local stuff that's going on.
Yeah, speaking of democracy and participating in the process, I know that a handful of states have some kind of AI governance rules or regulations going on. But as you were saying, I think I read someplace recently that they described the United States in this regard as a legal void, or that it's sort of in its nascent stages, if anything. So Julia, can you talk a little bit about your participation in, you testified or you have given a lot of sort of advice to city government. Can you talk a little bit about your involvement in that?
Sure, and in the interest of time, I'll keep it very brief. I already responded to several questions in Q&A and also in chat, giving folks links to some of the work that is underway in New York City. And as Eric mentioned, we are now deliberating with as much of public input as possible. So do please inform yourself and speak up on the use of algorithmic tools in hiring. And this is an opportunity for New York City to lead. Although, of course, the European Union is far ahead of us in terms of technology regulation, they also are not regulating the use of algorithmic tools in hiring. And so they are faced with all of the same problems as we are here. New York right now is considering a bill. There is an opportunity to speak up. Please take a look at the links that I shared. Yeah, and Eric already mentioned the Automated Decision Systems Task Force. I was a member of that task force. Unfortunately, we didn't get very far at all because the city refused to disclose any information to task force members about any of the automated decision systems that they run. And now that they came up with this report, I pasted the link. The city says that they, across all of its agencies, tens of agencies, run 16 automated decision systems, which I personally find hard to believe. So I think we need to apply a lot more public pressure on our government in New York, on your local government, to demand more information.
Brian, well, one thing that we want from our cities is, as Eric was saying, that there needs to be a certain reciprocity, and often that sort of takes the form of explainable AI, right? Like in the EU, I think one of the rules they have is that if you're sort of I don't want to say victim, but if you're a recipient of some kind of automated decision, whether it's for loans or that you have to have it explained to you, that you have that right. I'm not sure if I'm getting that correct, but you can tell me. And I was just wondering, why is it so hard to explain certain things in AI to people? What's this whole thing about a black box that we always hear?
Yeah. So, as your summary, I think, is pretty accurate. The GDPR in the European Union has calls for what's come to be known as a right to an explanation. So if you're adversely affected, you apply for a credit card, it gets rejected. You have some right to know why that happened. And I think this is a really interesting piece of the legislation because many machine learning systems have this reputation for being quote unquote black boxes. So if you look, for example, at the kinds of image recognition systems that, even 10-year-old vision recognition systems are these deep convolutional neural networks with 650,000 artificial neurons and 60 million parameters that are tuned through backpropagation and stochastic gradient descent. And they do some sort of transformation to the pixels that then outputs this kind of softmax probability of what it thinks it's looking at. it is far from obvious what role each of those 60 million parameters plays in the network. And it was very interesting to me seeing the lawyers for tech companies protesting to the EU regulators and saying like, hey, you're essentially calling for something from a regulatory perspective that doesn't exist. Like this is an unsolved scientific problem to understand what's going on in a deep neural network. And the regulators, unmoved, said, well, that's why the law doesn't go into effect for 2 years. So, do the science, figure it out. And I think that to me is an interesting undercurrent here, which is that, regulation is often portrayed as stifling innovation. But in fact, there was this huge boom in the actual computer science work of transparent, explainable AI that was a direct result of this regulatory requirement. So I think that's kind of an interesting sub-theme here. But I would say from a 2021 perspective, this is one of the most exciting subfields in all of AI, that we are seeing the work of people like Cynthia Rudin at Duke University, who is showing that surprisingly simple models are often competitive against these deep neural networks. And so why build the complicated thing and then explain it after the fact when you can just be really smart about how you assemble a simple model? And so, for example, she and her collaborators have shown that you could make a model as accurate as the compass model that we discussed earlier, and the entire model can fit into a single sentence. It's something like, if you have more than 3 prior offenses, predict rearrest. If you're under 20 years old and male, predict arrest, and something else. There's a third condition, like if you're under 23 and you have 2 priors, then predict arrest. That's the entire model. And
I'm
so,
sorry, I just have to say this. This is because compass is really inaccurate. That's why you could be flipping a coin also. So that is actually not a very strong result that you can replicate the accuracy of compass, because it's just really bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting point, right? Is that we often compare models to humans, right? In the domain of chess, we compare Deep Blue to Garry Kasparov. In Go, we compare AlphaGo to Lee Sedol, one of the great players of all time. But in a lot of these really consequential domains, we are comparing these models to not the greatest humans of all time, but just what is the human status quo. And in this case, the human status quo is also inaccurate. So I think that's a meaningful difference when we think about these things in real world applications. But to this point about transparency, I think there is huge advances in the actual computer science, but there's also a culture shift. So one thing that I would say to people thinking about careers or thinking about education is that within the field of computer science, these questions of fairness, accountability, transparency have gone in the span of about 5 years from being basically taboo to being, I think, some of the most prestigious conferences within the field, some of the most exciting areas. And so there's a real opportunity for folks who are thinking about getting involved in this field. There is just an incredible amount of excitement and momentum in this area. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in the sorts of things we're talking about today to pursue it, because I think this is one of the fastest growing and most important areas in computer science.
So we have transparency, we have building more trust with relationships in local city government, and actually active participation, which thank you, Julia, for sharing the links in the chat box. And if you're not seeing them come through, please check those out. And Safiya, we wanted to sort of bring you into this conversation here too. Looking at all the details and assessing what's going on, what's a way forward with technology? What are some things that we should be thinking about as we're moving into 2021? And we've sort of taken assessment of the risks and what's at stake here. What do you think are some questions we should be asking and some things that we should be doing?
Well, one of the things I want to underscore is that the most important thinking in the world right now are coming out of humanists, social scientists, community organizers, activists, people who are where the rubber meets the road when it comes to the harms coming out of the tech sector broadly. And one of the things I think is that we want to remember is that, and I put a link to this, a kind of wired excerpt from my book where I talk about how, the response to the civil rights movement at the moment when women and people of color get a modicum of participation in our society post 1964, we see the rise of a belief in computing as more accurate and more reliable to make decisions about society than the people who just got an opportunity to participate in the governance and having a say over their lives after hundreds of years of oppression and occupation. We see a remaking, a refashioning of power into streams of society, industries that quite frankly reconstitute the same people who've always been in power. And I think these are the kinds of critiques that are coming forward that are in dialogue with this kind of new emerging space of AI and ethics, let's say, or AI and society, technology and society. It's really the society part. It's the people who understand society. I tell all of my computer science students all the time, you have no business making technology for society, and you know nothing about society. You don't take sociology courses. You don't take Black studies courses. You don't take gender studies courses. You don't actually understand the application. You don't know that when you're, let's say, making an algorithm to incentivize the financial markets, to gamify the mortgage markets, that you're triggering a recession that is then the largest wipeout of Black wealth in the history of the United States. All the gains of Reconstruction, all the gains of the civil rights movement effectively were wiped out in the recession. Now, if you understood something about society and what it took, how many people died for those gains, you would actually never be able to ethically or morally make technologies that would facilitate that and make it so opaque and so difficult to understand. So these are the kinds of stakes. We're not really talking about technology here. We're talking about power in our society. We're talking about justice. We're talking about equity. We have more data and technology than ever, and we have more inequality globally to go with it. So I think the way forward to me is about doubling down on democratic public institutions like libraries, like schools, like universities, public health, public media, public institutions that actually can serve as a counterweight to what has come to be the technocracy that we're increasingly living under. That if you look around, you'll see at the highest levels of government, Eric Schmidt, all of the ex-Facebook employees coming over now to work in the new administration. I mean, we are going to have a real reckoning and a real honest set of conversations about who we think are the smart people to, engineer the society. And I think the people who've been the most harmed are the people, quite frankly, who need to move to the fore. And, this event, I think, is it's a great opportunity that the library is bringing this conversation to us should tell us about its import as well. And so I just want to say thanks for letting me kind of be a part of it. I know we're getting close to having no more time left.
Yeah, thank you. Those are some really key points, and we are running out of time, so I just want to open up the floor if any of our other panelists would like to share closing words or closing thoughts. We covered so much ground here, and I hope it sort of some of these questions piqued your interest, or some of these case studies really piqued your interest, and you can continue to investigate them through the links or through some of the books that these folks have written. And through more conversations, participating in more conversations like this. So I want to open up the floor if anyone on our panel has more closing thoughts to share.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask Brian, so the alignment problem is about sort of the difference between what we think what we're designing to do and what they actually do. So there's sort of a disjuncture between our purported values and what they think. So at the risk of cannibalizing your book sales here, can we solve the alignment problem?
I think that is going to be one of the central scientific questions of the 2020s. I think, and it's one which, as many of my fellow panelists have eloquently stated, it is a ostensibly technical question that is sort of increasingly crashing on all of these humanistic concerns, right? And I think we need to rethink computer science education as we try to tackle that. But to your question of whether it's solvable, I mean, one of the things I also want to highlight here is that there's this bleeding edge of what's called AI alignment research, which is how do we get these kind of complicated human norms, values, judgments into this machine learning software. And there are some, I think, genuinely encouraging results. So, there's one where just by watching videos of this robot backflipping or watching it move at random, you can enable this robot to do a backflip just by saying these movements look slightly more like a backflip than those. And so with no programming expertise, without the ability to sort of turn this aesthetic judgment into any sort of code, you can still kind of convey the sense of what you want the program to do into the system. Even if we can satisfactorily scale that up to these kind of broader questions of ethics, there is then an unavoidable question waiting for us at the end of that kind of technical process, which is who has a seat at the table? Whose judgment is it that's getting used? And so I think that's waiting for us on the other side of the technical part of AI alignment work, is really this question of governance, of whose opinion is getting tapped and who has a seat at the table. And I think those are bigger social and political questions that hang over it, and in some ways are more intractable than the actual kind of scientific technical aspect. So I think that's the challenge in front of us for this decade. And so from my perspective, it's going to take all the brain power we can throw at it. And so I say again, to folks who are interested in getting involved in this area, if you're a high school student, if you're a college student, I can't encourage you highly enough to look into ways that you can pitch in, because I really do think this is going to be one of the defining human projects of the coming decade.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So in the interest of time, we are unfortunately going to have to cut this conversation off. So I would like to say, thank you all for joining us. And I want to give everyone a chance to share your social media handles, or where we can find out more about the research that you've been doing, or the work that you've been doing. So we're going to go around and share. If you want to say a closing sentence as you go around and share, that would be good too. So you can share your social media, or you can share your websites, books. Some of you authors have places where you can find your books. So let's just go around and close out here. So thank you for joining us tonight. Start with you, Julia. I know that you have a
I already shared on chat. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, take care. AI responsibly. Brian?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this. For folks who are interested to learn more, I can recommend both Safiya's book and my book. Hers is called Algorithms of Oppression. Mine is called
Brian.
The Alignment Problem.
So
and
nice.
You can pick them up at your local NYPL branch.
Yes.
That's right. And Safiya?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Safiya Noble, and that's a place I like to hang out and share studies and retweet everybody and get shady and just have fun too. And of course, I'm at the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, C2I2, kind of like R2D2, C2I2.ucla.edu.
And Eric?
Yeah, I also work with Julie. I'm at NYU. If you go on my website or go on the AI Responsibly website, you can hear about the local public engagement work that we're doing here in New York, which is about really like democratizing the way that New York City is using AI. We'll also be providing some free, for now, online, what is AI sort of public education courses in the next couple of weeks. So if you go on my website or go on the Responsible AI website, you can find about that. It's just about providing broad, general, non-technical, public-facing AI education in a 5-week, 90-minute online class that's free.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I feel like we could keep talking for several more hours about all of these things, but I hope that you were able to pull something out of this discussion. I think that it clearly points in the direction that much more conversation needs to be had, particularly at sort of the intersection between different topics like computer science and ethics and critical race studies. So thank you all for bringing your words and your thoughts to the table and giving us a lot to chew and mull over. And so thank you for joining us. We offer classes at the New York Public Library technology training programs in essential technology skills. So anything from internet basics and mouse and keyboard skills to some entry-level coding, music production, audio production, video production, graphic design. So you can check out our classes at nypl.org/computers. If you want to follow us on Twitter, we're at NYPL Tech Connect at twitter.com, on twitter.com. And you can hashtag NYPL TechTalks. And if you want to continue the conversation on the internet, that's a good way to find us there as well. And so thank you for joining us. We'd love to hear your thoughts about it. So please feel free to reach out. And we really appreciate you joining and thinking with us. So thanks everyone, and take care.